Well, hello, my little gutter snipes. My name is Lord Hardthrasher, hereditary laird of enough of Scotland to really upset the locals, but not enough to warrant ever actually visiting, and quite possibly the reason that your mother celebrates your birthday 10 weeks later than your birth certificate says. Aside from being a peer of the realm, I also like to try and talk about history on the internet, hence me being here now, and hopefully you are here either because you fell asleep at your keyboard again, in which case sleep on, fair prince, you are doing great service to my length of view statistics, or because you want to know more about the bombing of Dresden in 1945, in which case you are most welcome. Now, as I hope the title makes abundantly clear, this is the second part in a two-part series on the subject. But wait, you don't need to have watched part one to enjoy this. Although I would say, if you love me, you will go back and watch it, partly because it'll help my engagement figures no end, and partly because I think it's a neat subject, and I suspect you'll enjoy it. We discussed the city, why the Allies decided to bomb it, how they came to that decision to bomb, and we also managed to squeeze in a great deal of other history. For example, we talked about the other medieval crusade that no one talks about, so that was fun. Anyway, today, this is the operation, the bombing, the horror, and all that jazz. So it is, quite frankly, a lot less fun, but hopefully interesting and informative nonetheless. A couple of housekeeping points before we crack on with the thing. I'm not going to go on bended knee, as so many people do right now, and beg for your subscription and so forth until the end. If you like it, do the thing. If you don't, don't. Easy. You'll note little Roman numerals that will come up on the screen from time to time. Those are citations that I'm using. They come from books that I've read, and I've put a bibliography below, and you can match those references to the bibliography, and you can see if you agree with what I've said. I am, after all, just a chap wittering on the internet. You should check everything at all times. Okay. Finally, viewers are strongly advised up front. This video contains, honestly, some of the most horrible shit in human history. It's genuinely some of the nastiest stuff I've ever covered, and also, I swear from time to time, so definitely headphones and deep breaths all round. Please don't play this one near the kids, okay? Alright, so let's crack on. Last time we left things with both the USAAF and the RAF forces ordered to bomb Dresden in the next clear weather window, which conveniently allows me, as an Englishman, to engage in one of the favourite topics of conversation of all Englishmen: the weather. The weather during basically all of World War II was exceptionally awful in winter and exceptionally hot in summer. For instance, it was minus 41 degrees centigrade in Moscow in the winter of 1940. And there are some quite fun websites out there where you can while away a few hours looking back and seeing city by city and month by month, if you choose, just how bloody awful it was. And I'll pop a link in the description for one of those sites that you can spend some time on. So much of the bomber war was predicated on good weather. The ability to navigate to the target, to see it and then hit it, and of course to get home safely required a sort of Goldilocks zone of clear weather over both England and the target for the times that the bombers were due there, and ideally a decent amount of cloud cover at the right height to mask the bomber's flight path. This of course never happened. Nonetheless, knowing what the weather was likely to do was key. It dictated not just the target selection, but things like fuel load and bomb load, probable time in the air, even the behaviour of the bombs themselves when they were dropped, and of course the effect that they had on the ground. And it dictated to a large extent which of multiple targets might be hit on any given mission. When it was cloudy, bombs had to be dropped using radar. Indeed, something like 70% of all US bombs were dropped actually using something called H2X, which was their version of H2S, which was the ground search radar that both the RAF and the USAAF used. And their average accuracy in such conditions was 2% of bombs within 1,000 yards of the aiming point. So, not ideal. Clear weather was, therefore, always preferable for both the United States Army Air Forces and for the RAF. The weather, of course, played a key role on what the enemy would do too. I mean, how many fighters they would send up by day or by night, where they were likely to fly from, where they were going to concentrate, what heights they were likely to fly at. All of that allowed planners to start to work out which routes they should send intruder raids on ahead of the bombing raid to go and break up those concentrations and take out those fighters. For much of the war, cloud meant ground-based flak, even radar-controlled flak, became next to useless. And of course, once you've actually done your bombing, you then need to determine what effect that they had had on the target. So that required recon photos, which meant especially adapted Spitfires and Mosquitoes of the PRUs, or photo reconnaissance units, would go out and go and take those pictures. If there was cloud cover everywhere, then there would be no photos, and you'd have no clue what damage was being inflicted on the enemy, and thus no feedback on whether or not continuing to pursue a particular strategy was having an impact, or you should change course. Famously, during the so-called Battle of Berlin between November of 1943 and March of 1944, of 37 PRU sorties sent by the RAF to Berlin, only 2 were successful. Harris lost hundreds of aircraft and dozens of crew, and had in reality no clue what he was or wasn't hitting. The weather was so bad that the crews themselves rarely saw the city that they were trying to bomb either. Weather forecasting then was critical, but in a world without satellites or supercomputers or even modern weather models, it was also, how can I put this delicately, shit. Often very shit. This wasn't for lack of trying. In 1944, the first attempts were made to use radar, and things were being trialled, like, for example, there were drop capsules that were being sent out of aircraft to drop through the atmosphere to try and give a radio signal back which varied in pitch so that a controller could tell what was going on at different heights, and there were a huge number of weather flights and observations and statistical analysis that was being done. It's just that it was all, well, not very good. As written, the Combined Target Committee had planned for the USAAF 8th Air Force to go in first, hit the Friedrichstader Bahnhof station and the surrounding marshalling yard, set the whole lot ablaze, and then the RAF would follow up that night, being able to see the fires from a distance, and they would try and bomb slightly further to the east. But then the weather stepped in, and with England surrounded by blanket fog and low cloud, the USAAF couldn't take off. Consequently, the RAF went in first. By 1945, the RAF's ballet of feints, electronic countermeasures and misdirection, combined with their overwhelming weight of force, was light years from where it had been earlier in the war. Back in 1942, having just taken over as head of Bomber Command, Harris had decided to make a statement raid, one which showed his intention to prosecute a new kind of air war, the Thousand Plan. Harris managed to scrape together 292 4-engined and 755 2-engine bombers for a total of 1,047 aircraft to hit Cologne on the night of the 30th and 31st of May 1942. Given that just over 30% of the crews were green units still in training, it's perhaps unsurprising that only 868 planes actually managed to find and bomb the city, dropping 1,455 tons of bombs in about an hour. Remarkably, just 469 people in the city died, despite the extensive damage. But keep those stats in mind around 4-engined and 2-engine and the weight of bombs that was going down. It was a one-off. Harris's formal frontline force was only around 600 planes, but just as he predicted, papers around the world carried stories about the 1,000 raid. RAF recruits in training in the United States and Canada reported being taken out by their North American hosts and fed drinks all night in celebration. At first, Nazi propaganda tried to deny that Harris could possibly have launched a raid that big, but internally they were stunned that so many aircraft could have attacked Germany in one night. Fast forward then to February of 1945, and Bomber Command was routinely sending raids of well over 1,000 aircraft into Germany. On the 13th of February, it was 1,406 strong. They were by now highly experienced, well-equipped and superbly organised. In the strike package headed for Dresden, there were 796 aircraft carrying 2,660 tons of bombs. That's nearly 2.5 times the bomb load per aircraft that had gone to Cologne 3 years before. They would, as one briefing officer put it to his crews, demonstrate to the Soviets exactly what the RAF can do. The opening act of the drama were 65 Mosquitoes of the Light Night Striking Force, there to spread electronic havoc over German radar screens and across the country. Behind them came groups of more Mosquitoes, the largest over 70 strong, carrying not just electronic jamming, but this time real bombs too, which they dropped on Magdeburg, Misburg, Nuremberg and Dortmund. As they fanned out, they further befuddled the ground controllers and set off air raid warnings across the Reich. Through the middle of this electronic cacophony streamed the main force of Lancasters and Halifaxes, totalling some 630 aircraft in all. At first, they jinked towards the Ruhr, the old Happy Valley as the crews had called it, bringing up German night fighters there before turning away and heading down south towards Nuremberg, and then switching back towards Leipzig and finally turning towards Dresden. As they flew on beyond Leipzig, 386 of them, mostly Halifaxes, peeled off to go and hit the Braunkohlebensin synthetic fuel plant near Bollhen at exactly 10 p.m, while 244 Lancasters of 5 Group pushed on to Dresden itself. The confusion in the Luftwaffe air defence network was total. None of the 30-plus Bf 110 night fighters that were stationed at the nearby Klotzsche airfield were scrambled. Air raid sirens went off across eastern Germany, not least in Dresden itself, but people there took no notice. The sirens in Dresden had sounded over 100 times by now, and there had been no attacks. Why would tonight be any different? But it was different. At 10:03 p.m, the first target indicators, or TIs as they were known, began their long, lazy descent towards the city, dropping exactly as planned over the Sportspalaz and the Ostragerhege Stadium. Locals gaped upwards in horror and understanding as the so-called Christmas trees began to come down. At 10:06 p.m, the local air raid leadership finally and belatedly broadcast a warning over the local area radios and shelters and public speakers, ordering the population to take cover immediately. But the bombs were already falling. For the civilian population, the nightmare had just begun. For the crews in 5 Group above, it was just another fraught night, although not as fraught as they might have imagined when they'd been briefed. All of the heavy flak around Dresden, and most of the light flak too, much of it captured from Russia in 1942, had been removed and sent east to face the advancing Soviet forces. This sounds bizarre given how familiar all of us are today. If you know the air war, you know about the central role that flak played in combating both day and night bombers. But in fact, by the 6th of February 1945, 21% of all flak guns across the Reich had been transferred to the front. The Reich was truly falling apart at the seams. In all, Bomber Command would lose just 9 aircraft across Germany that night, and none over Dresden itself. After 6 long, bloody years, the RAF was fucking good at destroying targets, both large and small. After an 850-mile trip conducted in the dark without being able to see the aircraft around them, the entire force was over the target in a window of just a few minutes long. Over the target area, the raid itself was controlled by a master bomber circling low below them, looking at the fall of bombs. And in this first wave, it was a chap called Flight Lieutenant Topper, who was actually able to talk over VHF radios to individual crews, calling them into the attack. Undisturbed by flak or night fighters, he ordered the aircraft down to just 12,500 feet, maximising their attack potential, and told them to take their time when lining up on the target. Each aircraft was equipped with a superb and relatively simple Mark 14 or Blackett sight, which was easy to operate at night. It offered a high degree of accuracy, and unlike the US Norden, it could maintain lock even if the bomber had to manoeuvre in the run. On the final approach, it required just 10 seconds of straight and level flight, far shorter than the US sight. And then there was the final 5 Group innovation, the attack run itself. Topper ordered each successive aircraft onto a 2-degree offset from the previous one, and then to delay their bombing by a few seconds more each time, creating a fan shape setting out from the Ostragerhege Stadium outwards. As he visually confirmed the attack in progress, he pushed the wedge beyond its originally intended attack zone and slightly to the south, so that the beaten zone almost touched the open green space of the Grosse Garden of Elector Johann Gregor III. In a little over 15 minutes, they had dropped 881.1 tonnes of bombs, releasing an average load of just over 7,200 pounds every 3.5 seconds. The wedge-shaped target zone was plastered by hundreds of high-explosive bombs and over 200,000 incendiaries, starting thousands of small fires in factories, homes, apartment buildings, shops, and, critically, in the Hauptbahnhof railway station. In July 1943 in Hamburg, where the last great firestorm had been started, some bombs had fallen up to 7 miles outside of the target zone. Over Dresden, 90% of the bombs fell inside a kill zone 1.25 miles long and 3/4 of a mile wide at its widest point, and the results were nothing short of catastrophic. The bombing knocked out power, shattered water mains, ignited gas lines, destroyed water reservoirs, smashed up buildings, threw rubble into the roads, and effectively sealed the entire Altstadt from outside help. First responders began to battle their way to the area, and people began to leave their shelters to emerge into a wall of destruction. Dazed but alive, the work of survival began, just as the RAF planners knew that it would. They knew that some would try and return to their homes to douse the fires with stirrup pumps and fire blankets. They knew that fire teams were trying to get in as quickly as possible, and they knew that this would take time, which is why they made sure a second, far larger wave of bombers was there to follow up 3 hours later. 529 Lancasters from 1, 3, 6 and 8 groups could see the fires on the ground from 50 miles away as they homed in on their target. Unlike the previous wave, this stream flew almost directly across eastern Germany before turning to Dresden itself. It was enough on this night of utter confusion and failure by the Luftwaffe ground controllers to throw them again off their game, and no fighters were scrambled to intercept. At 1 a.m. in the Dresden Air Defence Leadership bunker, there was a message that was logged saying that a new bomber stream was in the region, but that it wasn't clear where it was going. 7 minutes later, the sirens in Dresden, or those at least still with power, sounded again. Not that the people that were still alive in the Altstadt could hear them. No power was there, no sirens were sounded south of the Elbe. Arriving over the target area ahead of the second wave, the new master bomber, Squadron Leader CPC de Veslo, saw that it was already a mass of flames. He considered that it would be a waste of bombs to hit the same area again, so he ordered the crews to bomb the fringes of the flames. This in effect changed the axis of attack west of the Altstadt, so now the epicentre of this far larger raid would be the Hauptbahnhof rail yards, and it would massively increase the beaten area of the attack. Bombs fell almost to the suburbs of the city and across, critically, the Grossgarten Park area. This had become a major rallying point for civilians after the first raid, and onto the banks of the Elbe, where yet more civilians had fled the flames from the first wave. The decision to spread this bombing out meant that Dresden had the dubious honour of having the most area of a single city destroyed in a single attack on Germany during the entire war. After 12 minutes, de Westler realised little more could be done and ordered the remaining bombers to just simply aim for the middle of the fires on the ground. In 24 minutes, Bomber Command unloaded 1,206 tons of explosives, including 300,000 incendiaries into the area. And with that, the last crews turned for home. It was a long, tense flight back, waiting for night fighters that never came up, and then a hot meal, bed, another mission ticked off, another step closer to finishing the tour. Behind them, hell had emerged onto the face of the earth. This next bit is not, as you might imagine, a lot of fun. I want you to keep in mind two things as we discuss what happened on the ground. Firstly, Dresden has been studied for over 80 years now. Testimonies have been collected and collated from hundreds of sources, which can make their experience sound uniquely horrific. But really the only difference between Dresden and a number of other raids was scale. It was bigger. Bigger mostly doesn't matter if you are a mother trying to guide her child to safety through burning streets on the ground. It's impossibly huge to you anyway. The experiences of individuals trapped within its horror was therefore basically Tuesday in the Second World War. Millions went through things like this. The second thing I want you to keep in mind is that when I or anyone else blithely says they dropped this many bombs on the cities or in these areas, this section is what it meant for people on the receiving end. In Dresden that night, in their badly made, unreinforced basements, or in designated shelters without gas doors and without air filters, the men, women and children of the city died of many causes, but rarely from explosions directly. At first there were small fires, thousands of them in roofs and bathrooms and bedrooms and cars and public buildings and factories and on the street. In other cities, the Reich local authorities had warned the population to get out of the shelters as fast as possible once they heard the explosions died down, not to wait for the all-clear signal, just to get out as quick as you could. This had a dual effect. Firstly, people were able to rush out and up into the buildings and put out small fires using buckets of sand or stirrup pumps or baths that they'd been told to fill with water ahead of time, which meant that they got on top of fires before they broke out. But it also meant that if the fires did grow, they would not kill the people in the shelters from carbon monoxide poisoning caused by the flames. On the litany of failures of the Gauleiter, Martin Mutschmann, and his staff to make even basic provision for air attacks, there were two in particular that combined to a deadly effect. Firstly, there were very few air raid sirens, and all of them needed external power which had just failed. Secondly was the strict order of the population to stay in their shelters until they heard the all-clear signal, a signal which was supposed to be transmitted by those same sirens. Critical time was lost as decisions had to be made by those in the shelters about whether or not they would disobey the authorities and emerge, in a society in which you had been conditioned for at least 12 years not to disobey the authorities. Time then ticked by, time that allowed the fires to grow long after the bombers had gone and burn and burn and burn until they created sheets of flame that engulfed whole neighbourhoods. This then was the firestorm in Dresden, as it had been in Hamburg, in Kassel, in Darmstadt, in Ludbeck and many other places besides and between. The individual fires became one almost continual column of flame, spiralling up 13,000 feet above the city. Dutiful citizens who'd stayed in their private shelters waiting for the all-clear were cooked or burnt or asphyxiated in place. It's thought as many as 75% of those who died did so from oxygen deprivation before their bodies were consumed by flames. Worse, there had been orders to knock through cellar walls between houses and apartment blocks used by the vast majority of civilians to shelter in, with the idea that this would allow easier escape should one exit be blocked. In practice, this created a funnel from which the fires could suck air out from multiple shelters at once, or became chimneys as the flames roared through, killing the occupants for whole blocks of houses at a time. Attempts to escape were thwarted repeatedly, precisely because residents stayed too long below ground as the firestorm above gathered pace and their homes and apartments collapsed on top of them, making escape impossible. In the main station, the Hauptbahnhof, hard hit in the second wave, there was a public shelter large enough to take 2,000 people. Inspections conducted by the Rail Inspectorate in late 1944 had noted that there was no air filtration system, there were no gas-proof doors and only a few unlit emergency exits, often up steep sets of stairs in critical places. In the minutes before the raid, trains attempting to transit through Dresden had been stopped and their passengers directed towards the shelters. In a matter of moments after the first bombs fell, the electric lights down there failed, plunging this mass of humanity into darkness. As the firestorm enveloped the area, the network of cellars that made up the shelter became one vast airless oven. The flames above sucked oxygen up and pumped choking smoke and carbon monoxide down. Breathing felt like drowning. Deeper breaths did nothing but compound the sensation, as with each breath, carbon monoxide bonded to the hemoglobin in the blood, denying the oxygen to the body that it needed. A sort of weird, hallucinatory, lethargic panic swept through the shelter. In the darkness, in the smoke, the flame, the heat, they fought and clawed and fell down, choking on the air itself. Rescue workers later found their bodies wedged into doors so tight that they had to be cut out, whilst behind them thousands lay on the floor untouched by flame or bomb, but quite dead. Those who did emerge from their shelters found themselves in the heart of a city transformed into one solid mass of roaring flame. Some wetted cloths and put them over their face and mouths, and then tried to wet their clothing and move towards imagined spaces of safety, as superheated gale-force winds tore around them, throwing hundreds of thousands of hot cinders into the air, into clothing, into eyes, into mouths, burning, blinding and choking survivors. Accounts are vivid and confused in equal measure. Some spoke of children and pets being ripped off the ground and sucked into the flames. Others of family, friends and neighbours whose hair and clothing suddenly combusted, transforming them into screaming human torches. Trees dozens of yards back from the flames exploded as the sap within them caught fire and they were ripped from the ground by the wind. And through this hell people tried to move to escape somehow. Survival was in many ways pure chance, a snap decision to go left or right towards an open space, and either there get cut off or get through. A simple decision to wear the wrong footwear could prove fatal. Every surface was burning hot, stonework and bricks cracked, glass melted, cobblestones burnt flesh like steak on a grill if it was touched, and the soles of shoes melted, exposing feet to this terrible heat, causing some to fall and to be so badly burnt that they couldn't get back up. Road surfaces became a sticky, burning morass into which those who stumbled could become engulfed and pinned to the spot like flies on red-hot paper, where they burnt or died of asphyxiation. Survivors of one direct hit on the Witsum High School's Military Reserve Hospital managed to gather in a circle, hands on one another's shoulders and wet cloths placed over their faces and mouths, putting out sparks which threatened to set one another's clothes on fire and stay in the lee of a miraculously untouched building. They stayed there until dawn some 6 hours later and formed the only survivors of the hospital's pathetic shelter. One of the few provisions that the authorities had made for fire caused by bombing was a series of water reservoirs set up in squares and open spaces across the old city, the idea being that if the water sources were broken, then the emergency services could use these as an alternative. The largest was in the Altmarket, the Old Market, at the heart of the Altstadt district, hit by the first wave. Measuring some 130 feet long, 65 feet wide and 10 feet deep, it had been rendered useless, cut off by collapsing buildings and debris. There were no ladders or ropes or handles on the inside of its smooth concrete walls. As a firestorm raged, hundreds dived in, only to find themselves unable to escape again, and ironically in that sea of flame they drowned. The few who did manage to haul themselves out were burnt to death. In smaller tanks where people could stand, some were boiled alive, and others simply died of asphyxiation where they stood. The firefighting teams had been in the main decimated by the second wave of bombers, which killed the men and smashed much of their equipment. With the water pipes shattered, just as the planners in High Wycombe had intended, they fought to find sources of water that they could run their hoses from. In a final heroic act of courage, a few managed to get their pumps up and working and tried to spray the fleeing civilians, making a temporary passageway through the flames until their hoses ran out of water and they either fled or were killed themselves. Many of those who survived the first wave managed to do so by getting to open ground or getting to the banks of the Elbe River. As the second wave dropped on the edges of the fire, these survivors were torn apart by direct hit from high explosives and incendiaries, turning the Grosser Garten into a charnel house, littering the trees with body parts. I'm not going to press the point any further. I could talk about this for hours. If you want to read the accounts, there are dozens, and you will find them in books referenced in the description. Of the 220,000 homes in Dresden, 75,000 were destroyed, and more than 350,000 people were made homeless. 15 square miles of the old city was completely burnt out. For the dazed survivors milling around the next day, the ordeal was not over. Way back at the Casablanca conference, Hap Arnold and Ira Eker had sold Churchill on the idea that the RAF would bomb by night and the USAAF by day, and thus Germany would be under constant around-the-clock attack. It had been, in January 1943, nothing short of a pipe dream, born of the sort of idealism that many United States officers had had at Maxwell Field back in the day. However, by 1945, the USAAF and RAF had grown exponentially, and they could mount not just round-the-clock bombing, but multiple missions in a single 24-hour period if needed. And by agreeing to a joint command structure, they increasingly behaved as a combined bomber force for the first time, despite the odd tantrum by both Sparks and Harris. The Dresden raid was one such combined op, and although the USAAF had been delayed, on the 14th they went into action. Like the RAF, the 8th Air Force launched a multi-pronged attack designed to scatter and disperse the defenders. Overall, 1,377 aircraft of the 1st Bombardment Wing, backed up by over 750 P-51 escorts, flew against Germany that day. The weather was not good, and it's worth saying that out loud up front, and as a result, 340 B-24s that had originally been going to go and target some synthetic oil plants diverted to Magdeburg to go and hit the marshalling yards and had to bomb using H-2X, so that's the H-2S or radar bombing. 294 B-17s went to Chemnitz, and 311 B-17s actually went on to Dresden. Those of you doing the maths at home might note that those figures don't quite add up to 1,377. The balance, more than 400 aircraft, managed in broad daylight to miss Dresden, indeed miss Germany altogether and bomb Prague accidentally. It would seem that missing targets by whole countries was not confined to the RAF of 1941. Spatz's increasing impatience with precision bombing can be seen in his order for the day, which simply stated that the target was the centre of the built-up area of Dresden, an order moderated by his staff to aim for one of the 3 marshalling yards. The raid was, in fact, one of 3 weather contingencies, which got rather muddled up, and as a result the wings got confused and mixed up in the air and attacked from different directions. A very carefully worked out plan on the ground simply went to ratchet. Dresden was obscured by smoke still pouring from the fire started by the RAF attacks 10 hours before, so this was blind bombing, and post-raid analysis noted that the majority of bombs fell into heavily built-up areas of the city. Nonetheless, in a little over 13 minutes, 8th dropped 771 tons of bombs on the stricken city, including 130,000 further incendiaries. On the ground, the US attack appeared to be deliberately aimed at the traumatised survivors of the night's raids, as sticks of bombs fell apparently at random across the city. On the following day, the 15th of February 1945, 1st Air Div was on ops again, this time trying to hit the Bohlen hydrogenation plant near Leipzig, but 10 tenths cloud forced them to divert to their secondary target, Dresden, again. It was a shit show of an attack. The squadron leader of the 401st Bombardment Group somehow managed to drop his markers a full 4 minutes too early, and this resulted in nearly 200 bombers dropping on Meissen and not Dresden. The remainder, realising the mistake nonetheless, managed to completely miss the Friedrichstadt marshalling yards, but hit the prison building, the justice building actually, in the Muncherplatz instead. In the process, they neatly destroyed its electric guillotine and allowed a mass breakout of condemned prisoners, which, okay, good, well done lads, but fuck me, that's not a railway station. In truth, both the United States Army Air Force's attacks were really aftershocks from the earthquake that had been the RAF night attack. Fires were still burning days later across the city. Almost all of the city's records were destroyed, including lists of dissidents and informers, and crucially of the remaining Jews. The Opera House, which had been considered one of the finest in Europe, was burnt down along with the Royal Palace. The hardest blow, at least culturally speaking, came on the 15th. As the stones of the Frauenkirche cooled, they shattered and the magnificent church where Bach had played the organ at its consecration collapsed in on itself. As dawn broke on the 14th of February 1945, chaos reigned not just in the streets but also in the political order. Initially, nothing was heard from Gallard or Mutschmann. The city's mayor, Hans Nieland, by contrast, took one look around at the devastation, realised rightly he was going to be blamed, and attempted to flee the scene. Caught red-handed by the police with literally suitcase in hand, he was dragooned into helping to try and sort the mess out, a task he was patently not up to, and he was relieved of his position on the 19th of February. It's a bit of an aside, but somehow the bastard avoided being shot on the spot. He disappeared for 8 days, reappeared briefly in Berlin, and then popped up again in Denmark with a completely different rank and a new identity, where he stayed until the end of the war before he was arrested by the Allies. And they say, owning your mistakes always pays. It might have been February 1945, but this was still Nazi Germany, so of course there were competing organisations and politics involved in the clean-up. With every major administrative building smashed, the only authority in the city still pretty much intact was the higher SS and police who'd survived in Muchman's bunker. Appealing to Himmler for help directly on the 14th yielded an immediate response, and a, quote, "special task force you will find most useful," was dispatched to Dresden. More of those lovely people in a moment. In parallel, there was Goebbels, whose remit was supposed to run to all things air raid cleanup, and so he sent a chap called Theodor Elring, chief executive of the Interministerial Air War Damage Committee, and no, I am not going to attempt that in the German. Elring was a committed Nazi, but also a highly competent and ruthless administrator, and by this point in the war, Dresden was not his first rodeo. He immediately mobilised the slave labour force that was on hand, plus 1,000 Allied POWs, to begin cleaning up operations, opening key roads and closing others down to get things moving. As we observed in part 1, there were many, many troops in the Neustadt barracks on the other side of the river at the north, who, well, initially didn't move. Because Dresden was so close to the front lines now, technically the south side of the river was the front line rear area, and the north side was, well, the front line area, so if the troops left their barracks to help, they were, technically speaking, deserting and could be shot on the spot. This particular ball of wool was eventually untangled, but it took some 48 hours and more to do. Meanwhile, Elring was able to get 2,000 troops from the surrounding area drafted in, as well as repair teams from Leipzig, Chemnitz, Zwickau and Halle. Within 72 hours, they were serving 600,000 hot meals a day. Martial law was declared, and within 24 hours the authorities had shot 79 people for looting or rumour-mongering. The prisoners of war were put there to do the most horrific work, finding body parts, shriveled, mummified corpses on streets and in cellars, and burying them in mass graves outside the city limits. But it was all taking time, and the mass of bodies began to rot, and so the risk of disease increased. Fortunately, Himmler's contribution now came to the fore, as the team that he'd sent were former guards from the Treblinka death camp, and they set about bringing their particular form of expertise to the problem. The Altmarket was sealed off, a shallow pit was dug, and it was overlaid with metal girders taken from the wreckage of nearby buildings. Bodies were brought in en masse, registered, and then piled onto the makeshift griddle, where they were doused with gasoline and burnt in batches of 500 at a time. They managed to burn some 6,865 bodies between the 21st of February and the 5th of March 1945, with the ash from the human remains being dumped into pits. The authorities raced, using forced labour of course, to try and get the rail network connections up and going, and they did manage within a couple of weeks to get some rolling stock moving, but really the rail network around all 3 primary centres was smashed, and telephone connections, vital for efficient operations, weren't re-established for over a month. At the end of the war, Dresden's rail network was still pretty fucked. Over 200 factories, including the multiple plants belonging to Zeiss Ikon, were destroyed, and about 40 other works described as important to the war effort were lost. Absenteeism through death, homelessness and desperation meant that less than half of the workers in untouched factories were showing up for work, a figure that didn't recover by the end of the war. Reaction in the higher-ups in the Nazi Party varied from Hitler's cold rage to Goebbels' suggestion that Germany should now abandon the Geneva Convention and just start to shoot Allied prisoners of war out of hand. Robert Ley, head of the Nazi Labour Front, represented an anti-Christian view held by many Nazis who were apparently so proud of being German that they thought they should burn down all of its cultural heritage and start again. He wrote a ranting article called Without Baggage, in which he celebrated the loss on the basis that the German people could now fight harder with a clean slate. Totally sane and without any parallel in modern history. On the ground, hundreds of thousands of new refugees trudged off through the snow, seeking shelter elsewhere and spreading news of what had just happened. A feeling of certain doom descended on eastern Germany. On the 16th of February 1945, Air Commodore Griesen had what we might call a bit of a bad day in the office. As a member of the RAF's press office in Paris, he was asked what his thoughts were on the Dresden raid and others like it. Thinking on his toes, Geerson said that the Allies were targeting cities where evacuees were moving through and also where communications traffic moved through, and thus hitting them would probably help the Russians. So far, so good, I guess. I mean, a smart reporter would have realised that he just admitted that the Allies were targeting refugees, but it would probably buff out. However, a follow-up question was asked with words to the effect of, "Did you just say refugees or communications?" Geerson, sensing danger, confirmed that it was all primarily about movement. And then, in a moment that he probably relived for much of the rest of his life, said that it was also about destroying what was left of German morale. Oh fuck. This was, of course, the truth. The British had been area bombing primarily to hit industry, but also to wear down morale. Since the start of the war, Sinclair had explicitly ordered Harris to conduct his area attacks with exactly this in mind, but no one had said it quite as brazenly in public before. Here was the RAF confirming that they were hitting refugees, and that they were hitting cities to break morale. AP correspondent Howard Cohen, listening in, realised that he had a story and submitted a draft cable to the censors in Paris that read, "Allied air bosses have made long-awaited decision to adopt deliberate terror bombing of great German population centres as ruthless expedient to hasten Hitler's doom. More raids, such as British and American heavy bombers carried out recently on residential sections of Berlin, Dresden, Chemnitz, Koblenz, are in store for the Reich with the avowed purpose of heaping more confusion on Nazi traffic tangle and sapping German morale. All-out air war on Germany became obvious with unprecedented daylight assault on refugee-crowded capital 2 weeks ago and subsequent attacks on other cities jammed with civilians fleeing Russia in tide east." Now, given that Goebbels had been accusing the British and Americans of terror bombing for years, that Archibald Sinclair, Minister for Air, had assured the Houses of Parliament that he was not overseeing a campaign of deliberately targeting German civilians, despite the fact that he was, that Churchill had been a major cheerleader for this campaign as a whole, and this raid in particular, but was now worried about the post-war settlement, and that the Americans were incredibly sensitive about accusations of area bombing. Never mind terror bombing, this was, to put it mildly, an incendiary report, if you'll excuse the pun. At no point had Geerson used the word terror in his briefing. That was Cohen's addition. Reporter sexes up story, news just in, right? For some inexplicable reason, the United States censors in Paris let the story through, and all hell broke loose. Questions were asked in Parliament by the long-time opponent of the bombers, Rapier Stokes, the Labour MP for Ipswich. I'll be honest, the question was a bit stupid in that he wanted to know, quote, why the Russians had not indulged in blanket bombing whilst still enjoying great military success, unquote. To which the obvious answer would have been, well, gross incompetence, technological backwardness and a gleeful disregard for killing millions of their own troops, but one rather suspects that such an answer would not have helped. As the story was officially embargoed by the British censor, Rapier made sure to read the whole thing, word for word, into the parliamentary record, which of course then could be reported on by the British press, which let them off the leash, printing stories about how there was a massive change in policy and hinting darkly at a cover-up. Because there had in fact been a cover-up. In Washington, Henry Stimson demanded Marshall explain himself and provide assurance that the Russians had indeed asked for the raid, which of course Marshall struggled to do as he hadn't been in Yalta. The incident led Stimson to remove Kyoto from the A-bomb target list because, well, you know what, that's a whole other thing. We will get there one day. Goebbels, of course, was overjoyed by this sudden attack by the Allied press on their own forces and did his very best to try and load neutral countries' media with wildly inflated numbers of the dead and pictures of babies with phosphorus burns, which was a bit odd as neither the British nor the Americans had used phosphorus, so one shudders to think where he might have got them from. He ensured Arthur Harris was linked as closely to the numbers of dead as possible, saying, "The curses of a continent and the hate of a generation will be visited upon him," and suggested that 2.5 million people in Dresden had been there on the night of the attack. Again, bit odd, because if you apply even a modicum of brainpower to that claim, you'd conclude, if true, that the whole of the Eastern Reich had collapsed, which Goebbels was also simultaneously denying. Some media tricks are as old as the hills, I guess. When the final report on the Dresden raid was circulated internally in Germany, Goebbels took its figure of 20,204 dead and simply added a zero to make it read 202,040 dead. Modern estimates actually put the death toll somewhere between 25,000 and 35,000, although you will, of course, read much higher numbers for reasons I'll come to. There were rumours of thousands or tens of thousands of bodies sealed up in cellars below the city, but 80 years of near-constant redevelopment have yet to uncover more than a handful, so such stories can safely be put in the untrue pile. It was, nonetheless, the worst loss of life in an attack since Hamburg in 1943. In London, under fire from all sides, Churchill did a complete volte-face and suddenly fired off a fierce note known as the March Memo to Portal, essentially saying that area bombing was unjustified and that terror bombing was quite wrong. Again, that word terror. Harris read it and threatened once more to resign, and blotted his copybook terminally in the ensuing fight, saying that he did not consider all the cities in Germany as, quote, worth the bones of one British grenadier, a deliberate misuse of Bismarck's famous pronouncement that all of the Balkans were not worth the bones of one Pomeranian grenadier. I assume that he meant humans and not the annoying yapping dogs, although the idea of Bismarck with a Pomeranian is fucking hilarious, and God knows we need a laugh in this video. Anyway, back to the angry Rhodesian. Harris argued that at no point was he doing terror bombing. He was grinding down Germany's ability to fight as per his orders. He went on to say, the feeling such as there is over Dresden could easily be explained by a psychiatrist. It is connected with German bands and Dresden shepherdesses. Actually, Dresden was a massive munition works, an intact government centre and a key transportation centre. It is now none of those things. God, I love Harris when he goes off the reservation like this, but this was spectacularly misjudged. Bottomley pleaded with him to withdraw the note, but Harris wouldn't listen. Churchill did unusually withdraw his memo from the records, but it was in fact Harris's final political error. Harris had been at the helm of Bomber Command for almost exactly 3 years. He'd been fighting tooth and nail politically to get his command expanded, believing it to be key to victory. He threw his body and his soul into a grinding, endless conveyor belt of operations, analysis and planning. His command had grown exponentially, but so had his losses, and there can be little question that by 1945 he was close to being spent. The war had not turned out the way that he'd imagined. His pugnacious and stubborn style had won him few friends, and he knew it. By my count, he'd made at least 4 serious offers to resign over the preceding years. I think he was mentally ready to go. And this suited Portal and Churchill down to the ground. Both could have and should have acted sooner, but there can be little doubt that they were both intimidated by him. He was marked for replacement as soon as hostilities ended. Meanwhile, the arse-covering began in earnest. Churchill, Portal, Sparks and Arnold for the Americans, Sinclair from the Air Ministry, and our old friends Bufton and Bottomley had all urged and then ordered Harris to strike Dresden. Now they all suffered collective amnesia, threw up their hands in horror and demanded to know who was responsible, and there was Harris spoiling for a fight as ever, bouncing around the ring, shouting loudly about how he'd done it, he was right to do it and he'd do it again. Perfect. So they all decided in their own ways to blame him. Of all of them, only Harris had the guts to look the job in the eye that he'd been given and try to get his crews through it as best he could, and now protect them from the ire of his political masters. I think there is a certain nobility in that. For all his many, many flaws, I can respect Harris. The Americans went back to Dresden again on the 17th of April, but this time in a much more precise manner, hitting the rail yards again with over 1,500 tons of bombs and effectively cutting the rump of the Reich in half, even as Soviet troops advanced to the outskirts of Berlin. The USAAF launched mission number 968 against the Skoda works at Pilsen on the 25th of April and closed their campaign. And on the 2nd of May 1945, RAF Mosquito struck at Kiel for the final time in the European War. Harris had made ready for his exit from the RAF. As the war ended, campaign medals were struck for those who'd fought in Burma and Italy and France and so on, but not for the men of Bomber Command. Instead, they got the so-called Defence Medal, as they had served in the United Kingdom. They would have got that same award if they'd served tea to an officer in the mess in Chelsea Barracks, rather than watching their mates getting blown to pieces in the skies over Germany, or coming back to freezing bases to see rows of empty bunks, or drunk themselves into oblivion for fear of the dreams and faces that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Harris was appalled by the decision. He wrote to Portal that he would not accept any award from the government until his crews got the recognition he felt they deserved. When the King, in his birthday honours list later in 1946, personally awarded Harris something called the Grand Commander of the Order of Bath, or GCB, known by wags as God Calls Me Boss, Harris felt that he'd been blindsided, but as it was a personal gift from the King and not the government, he had no choice to accept with as good a grace as he could muster. He wrote again to Portal, saying the award was dust and ashes to me, and making clear officially that he would not accept any further awards or honours until his crews got a medal. Later in 1946, all the senior commanders for the British and Commonwealth forces were given what we call a peerage. Basically, it means becoming a peer of the realm. You get known as Lord whatever. For example, Tedder was made Baron Tedder, and from then on would be known as Lord Tedder. Portal and Monty both became Viscounts, and so on. These titles were mostly inheritable for all time, and until quite recently they meant that you got to sit in the House of Lords and vote on legislation too, although that's changed these days. Not so Harris. Almost uniquely, he got nothing, and he was not invited to the victory parade in Berlin. Initially, at least, the Soviets didn't have a lot to say about what had happened in Dresden. The city was taken almost without a shot being fired. Martin Mutschmann's previous boasts that Dresden would be turned into a Festung or fortress city was somewhat dented by the south side of the city effectively having ceased to exist, and his sudden realisation that, actually, now he came to think about it, he had more pressing business elsewhere, and he was just going to be away from keyboard for a few years. The Soviets promptly captured him in May, not long after they'd taken the city, dressed as a farmer. He was interrogated and then, well, he disappeared. His most likely fate was death in the KGB's prison in Moscow, the Lubyanka. Allegedly, he faced a trial on a firing squad in 1947, but there's an excellent chance he died of wounds sustained during his lengthy questioning, and certainly I fondly imagine that was the case. Either way, he was confirmed dead by 1948. The East Germans and their Soviet puppet masters did not initially play up the significance of the raids, focusing on the first anniversary instead on the rebuilding of the city. But as the Cold War hotted up, and especially after the Berlin airlift in 1948-49, and the communist coup just over the border in Czechoslovakia, the Soviet rhetoric ramped up. They started to condemn the horrific annihilation of Dresden by the Anglo-Americans every February. In 1950, a commission was established in East Berlin to control official commemorations of the war and to oppose American warmongers. Wildly inflated statistics were pumped out of 320,000 killed. Demonstrations were encouraged by the Soviet authorities each anniversary in carefully choreographed and tightly controlled outpouring of spontaneous grief, there to be captured by invited members of the press. The Korean War, of course, didn't help, and suddenly the Soviets were using phrases like Anglo-American air gangsters and terror bombing, which were lifted wholesale from Goebbels' playbook. And from Soviet propaganda to academic institution of the mid-1960s across Britain and America and the West as a whole, who started to talk up the death toll and the pointlessness of the whole thing, finding fertile ground in the shameless arse-covering of the various wartime leaders and commanders. And none of this would have mattered to the Trümmerfrau, or rubble women, picking through the remains of the city in the immediate post-war period. The Altstadt and surrounding area was cleared, mostly by women, mostly by hand, and the rubble was sorted for reuse in building, or it was buried. Many buildings which might have been saved were dynamited, apparently on safety grounds, but in reality for ideological reasons. Just as the Nazis had initially feared Dresden's history of relative tolerance and decency, the Soviets feared its bourgeois roots, and so they made a socialist city on socialist grounds with socialist architecture. The Soviet authorities did rebuild some cultural icons, the Opera House and the Royal Castle, and the Hofkirche, which sadly turns out not to be a temple to Michael Knight. The Frauenkirche was left as a ruin, a monument to the war, and of course not to God in this workers' paradise of the GDR, who had no time for things like religion. It wasn't rebuilt until the wall finally came down, and it was reconsecrated on the 30th of October 2005. So why did Dresden stand out, and what can it tell us about the war? It's worth saying in March 1945 alone, the RAF dropped a higher tonnage of bombs on Germany than it had dropped in the first 3 years of the war combined, and the USAAF wasn't far behind. These were some of the most devastating raids of the war. 1 in 4 people were killed in Pforzheim. 90% of Würzburg was wiped off the map in a raid that lasted just 17 minutes. 30% of Chemnitz was wiped out in one night, with the old targets of Essen and Dortmund being almost flattened, finally stopping their war production permanently. And I point all of this out because I want you to understand that whilst what happened in Dresden was at a larger scale, it was far from unique. And as I said before, the experience of those who went through the air war on the ground was unfortunately entirely normal for the Second World War. In hindsight, of course, you and I know that the war was nearly over and that the raid on Dresden therefore stands out. But in February 1945, General Schöner's Army Group Centre still had 1 million men under its command facing the Soviets, and there was a similar number facing the Western Allies along the Rhine. The war did not look over by a long shot. Mostly people know of the Dresden raid because of the propaganda of the controversy stirred up in the media, in Whitehall and by the Soviets, so that even today there are those who know nothing about the war, but they do know that Dresden was a terrible thing. And it's partly down to extreme writers like David Irving, who made up a whole bunch of figures around it, and much less extreme but nonetheless sensationalist writers like Mac Hastings, who've all demonstrably used the false figure of 100,000 dead, which have made it more deadly than the A-bombs over Japan, or come to that, the Tokyo firebombing. It's little wonder people sit up and listen to those kinds of numbers. Fighting a war has always been risky. Medieval armies basically did whatever they could to avoid direct confrontation, because even with overwhelming forces, there was always a chance you might get cressied by an angry Welshman with longbows or stabbed in the gob by a Cornishman with no scruples. It has become, over the centuries, bloodier and bloodier and nastier with each innovation. From the mid-1800s, wars became not just risky, but incredibly country-endingly bloody, especially wars between peers. I mean, just look at the United States Civil War. I mean, that's still the single bloodiest conflict they've ever fought in their history. Or the War of the Triple Alliance between Paraguay and basically everybody else in South America that wiped out 60% of the entire country's population, and from which they still haven't recovered. By the First World War, casualties were into their millions. And all of this should have meant that only a lunatic would try and fight a war in the mid-1930s. Yet Germany manoeuvred itself not just into a general war in Europe, but then a war on two fronts, a war with the United States and a genocidal war all at the same time. It is perhaps fortunate that we've discovered nuclear weapons, and in so doing made large-scale warfare between the world's leading states an act of mutual suicide, not just for the populations but for the leaders too. Putin attacked Ukraine, not China, for a reason. As to whether the bombing of Dresden was justified, it is, as I started part one by saying, bloody complicated. It does not fit into a neat box of all good, all bad. Bland statements like it was a war crime or they didn't kill enough Germans, made by the hard of thinking, do nothing to advance our understanding. It's not a clean subject. Wars are not clean. History is not clean. In a world which is now almost totally devoid of nuance, deeply divided along reactionary lines, where screaming at the opposition is normal, where cerebral inquiry into the facts is seen as some kind of betrayal, I can only say that we must understand our past to understand the decisions we need to make today, and that means understanding it for good, for ill, warts and all. Therefore, I can both understand strategically why Dresden was bombed, and I can appreciate how the commanders on the spot came to that decision and the way that they did it. At the same time, I can acknowledge the courage of the air crews. I can see, from a moral point of view, that almost any action, no matter how horrific, was fully justified to stop the murderous Nazi state. I can even point out that the Altstadt district was in fact the epicentre of Nazi support in the 1930s, and comment on the irony of that. But equally, I can read accounts of what happened and be genuinely shocked and appalled by the scale and the scope of human suffering, and wish that it had never happened. It is too messy a problem to untangle absolutely. At the end, all I can do is to conclude that you should not start wars, and if you have to fight a war, then win it as fast as possible by whatever means necessary to end the bloodshed. Which is an incredibly scary conclusion, because that is exactly what Curtis LeMay would say if he was sat here now. And we will see precisely how he put that philosophy into action in the future. So with those thoughts, I will love you and leave you, my friends. I hope that you've enjoyed this, and I'm guessing that if you've got this far, you probably did. So then could I please ask you to hit the like and subscribe buttons and leave a comment? It really does help people find this stuff. If you are so minded, then I have a merch store. It's pretty cool. Go check it out. I also have various social media handles, which are variations on Lord Hearthrasher, so stick that in your search engine and pick your poison. Of course, you will have noted that there are some sexy bastards with their names on the screen, and these are my glorious members of the Hellfire Club, and they got to see this video early and have access to a super secret Discord where you can chat to me as I have a cognitive breakdown trying to do videos like this. It costs £5 a month to join, plus whatever Patreon charges you. By the way, I would just point out, words to the wise here, whether it's my Patreon or anybody else's, do not join via the app. Join via the web page. The app charges you an additional amount, and then iPhones charge you a load more. In fact, it works out like 30% more expensive if you do it on your phone through Apple Pay, so don't do that. Anyway. The plan is now to stop the bomber war and go back to Burma for a bit. This is going to necessitate taking a fairly long break as I get my head out of Europe and into the reinvasion and advance to Rangoon. So bear with me, and I hope that between now and then we'll get some lighter, shorter, YouTube-friendly stuff out, and maybe a plane or two, who knows. In any case, I look forward to welcoming you back to my not-so-humble home soon. Until then, my lords, my ladies, my wonderful maybes, I bid thee adieu.